and welcome to History by the Pint, the podcast series that discusses all things history and archaeology in the time it takes to drink a pint. My name is Alex Rosen, I'm a producer and writer, and with me as always is Glyn Davis, a curator at Colchester Castle Museum, and Chris Siwicki, a lecturer and researcher in Rome. In this episode, Chris is talking to us about his latest, Notes from Rome. So Chris, it's that time of the year when you tell us all about the latest archaeological news from Rome. What are the main headlines from 2024?
So there's been quite a lot of activity in the last year because Rome's been preparing for the Jubilee year. So the Pope has called a Jubilee. The last one was in the year 2000. And in the build up to that, it's meant that a lot of sites have perhaps less archaeological sites, but more piazzas and public areas have undergone a bit of cleaning. But there's also been new work to make the city more manageable for the new numbers of new people coming. And that has led to a couple of new discoveries very close to the Vatican, in Vatican City, just before you enter the official bounds of Vatican City. In between that and Castel Sant'Angelo, which is the former mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian, there's a road runs past. It's quite a busy road, at a place called Piazza Pia. And in order to allow visitors not to just have to cross the road, they decided to build to divert the traffic through an underpass. As with anywhere in Rome, if you start to dig, you find something. And as they started to dig, they came across a series of discoveries, one of which was a large Phallonica site. So Phallonica is for processing fabrics, for processing wool. So they find this very large Phallonica site. I think there's something like 13 dolia, kind of these large vats sunk into the floor. It's kind of interesting to find it there because that area is very close to two luxury garden areas owned by female members of the imperial family at different times. Whether this Phallonica is connected to these luxury garden sites or you've got commercial activity going on there as well, I think is at the moment unclear. The material is, they released photographs in the press and the archaeologists explained a few things, but there's not a huge amount of context yet has been revealed about that.
It was a fairly stinky business, wasn't it?
Yeah, apparently so. I mean, if you go to Pompeii and Ostia, you can see kind of where they put the troughs and the vats near the street, where apparently you can urinate into them, and then I'm not a scientist, I don't know how it works, but somehow whatever is contained within urine, ammonia or something, expose my ignorance here, is somehow then breaks down certain things within woolen fabric, and so it's used in the processing of wool. And these things are on the street, and you've got stale urine. So I imagine it absolutely stank in the Mediterranean heat.
I suppose just one of the many lovely smells of the ancient
Well, it's all relative.
So maybe people weren't bothered.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
It's close to the Tiber. I can't imagine the Tiber was particularly pleasant smelling at that point either.
So that sounds really interesting. Is there anything else turned up in the sort of same general area?
Well, so as they kept digging the tunnel, although they're coming at the tunnel from two ends, so they start digging at the other end of the tunnel, closer to the Tiber. And first of all, they come across the ancient Tiber wall, so a huge embankment made of large volcanic stone blocks. And then they seem to come across what was probably a three-sided porticus structure, perhaps what more typically we should imagine is in a luxurious garden, some kind of space for recreation, for walking. But interestingly, there was a lead pipe was found in there, so pipe for transporting water stamped with Gaius Caesar on there, as in Caligula. And so we can link that specific part of the garden to the Emperor Caligula, who inherits it ultimately from Agrippina. And so actually we know we're in the gardens of Agrippina at that point, and so probably the Phallonica belongs to that area as well. Interestingly, in an ancient author called Philo, he mentions the fact that Caligula receives an embassy from Judea in the gardens of his mother by the Tiber. And so people have been quite quick to draw the conclusion that this could be the area. I mean, these gardens are enormous, but nevertheless, these are the gardens of Agrippina, and they eventually come into Caligula's hands as well. And again, it's that quite nice thing in Rome that you can link with quite a degree of certainty, actually, a very specific archaeological find with a very specific individual. And as I think we mentioned on a previous podcast, and when we were talking about new discoveries in Rome, only 300 meters away from that, last year they found, while renovating a 16th century palazzo, turning it into a hotel, they found the remains of a theatre with brick stamps for the Emperor Nero, which seems very likely to be the theatre that we're told in ancient authors Nero used to entertain people in privately. And so actually, it's only coincidentally, because they're part of separate digs and all of them were by chance, but in the space of a year and a half, you had some quite exciting discoveries, linked to Nero and Caligula in a particular area of the city that we don't really know a huge amount about.
So we've been discussing the emperors there, Chris, and we also have the many hills, including the Palatine, and I've heard something has been going on up there as well, new excavations.
Yeah, so what was very exciting this year was, for the first time in 50 years, part of what's known as the Domus Tiberiana, so that the house of the Emperor Domitian, the Emperor Tiberius, a slightly misleading name, has been reopened. So we don't know very much about where Tiberius himself lived. So the Palatine Hill, originally kind of the premier residential area of Rome, a lot of very famous late Republican Roman politicians have their houses up there. Cicero's up there, Clodius, his great enemy, and then Augustus, after he's come to power, purchases a property up there, lives in it, and gradually expands this property into a series of other properties. And it seems that members of his family also start to cluster on this hill, including in one corner Tiberius, so Augustus's adopted son and then successor. What precisely Tiberius's house looked like, we don't know. It probably safe to imagine that it was a series of properties or houses rather than a single unified palace. That all gets completely rebuilt by the Emperor Caligula, and then it seems also gets certainly alterations. New excavations suggest that Claudius is involved with rebuilding it. And then the Great Fire in AD 64 most likely destroys it, and Nero rebuilds that part of it as a kind of a standalone part of a palace, probably part of his larger Domus Aurea. Then the Emperor Domitian, a few years later, expands it and rebuilds it. And what you get is basically a large rectangular block on one corner of the Palatine Hill. And then this gets added to later by the Emperor Hadrian and then Septimius Severus. Now, the actual living quarters on top of the palace have all largely disappeared, and what you're left with is today a large garden with a nice terrace, and you can look out over the forum. What survives, though, are the substructures. So these were attached to the hill to basically extend the hill out. And there's a road which runs through the substructures, and then coming off either side of the road, so built up within the substructure of the palace, are a series of other rooms. And you can see parts of the Domitianic phase where it appears there's some kind of open loggia or belvedere for looking out over the forum. In the Hadrianic period, that gets covered up and they put in what appear to be a series of spaces for commercial or industrial activity. There's a bath building. These were all excavated in the mid 19th century by a person called Pietro Rosa. And following the excavation, and got re-excavated in the 50s, but following the excavations, there increasingly became structural issues in that this isn't actually part of the hill. It's basically enormous concrete structures constructed up against the hill, and they started to slip away from it. So the area was closed in the 1970s, and then there's been a decades-long campaign to, first of all, understand what's going on with the structure, and then to try and stabilize it as well. And now, for the first time, in 50 years, it's actually accessible. So if you get your ticket to the Palatine Hill or to the Forum and the Palatine, you can now walk up and get through that road again. What's great is the fact that it's open and that it's accessible.
It reminds me of just how complicated the archaeology of the Palatine actually is, where you seem to have building upon building. And, from my memories of visiting there, well, it was a while ago now, but it is quite a complicated space to understand, isn't it? Is there anything in this new building that's been discovered that sort of gives you a sense of lived-in spaces, perhaps? Or are there other areas on the Palatine that maybe are worth exploring as well?
Yeah, so the Palatine Hill is extremely confusing. It's confusing partly because, as you mentioned, there's a whole series of layers going right back. There are late Republican houses that they're not usually visitable, but there's Republican houses underneath the imperial phases. Then you have different emperors, so Nero followed by Domitian, stripping off a lot of the earlier layers and rebuilding their palace on top. Then you have the fact that it was turned into a garden in the Renaissance, and then it's been heavily excavated, but not all of it's been excavated. In the 1930s, there was a bit of dodgy restoration where they kind of reconstructed some walls that maybe should be there and maybe shouldn't. It's a beautiful space to walk around, and it's still relatively quiet, but it's exceptionally confusing. And that's true though for archaeologists as well as I think any general visitor. I mean, there's big debates over if you go there today, you can go to the House of Augustus, but is it actually the House of Augustus? It's labeled like that, and a lot of people suggest so, but there's good reasons to thinking that Augustus never lived in that building, and likewise, the other new opening, or it's been closed for over a decade, is the House of Livia, which there's zero evidence that the Empress Livia ever lived in that house, despite what the new video installation claims.
Right.
No, you go in there and it talks about how it's wonderful that it's open, and
Yeah.
it's a great space. It's part of a subterranean dining room of a house that gets partially demolished. When again Pietro Rosa in the 1860s he excavated it and he found a series of lead pipes which are stamped with different names, and one of them says Julia Augusta. Now, Julia Augusta could be any number of empresses, but not only that, but that lead pipe is then attached to two others with different names. These are clearly not in their original context.
Reused, yeah.
But he calls it the House of Livia, and it's stuck. And quite disappointingly, actually, in the new video installation, which otherwise is really excellent with kind of laser lighting of what the frescoes looked like when they first found them, insisting on this is definitely where she lived, and I mean that's yeah
difficult.
I mean,
yeah. Well, it sells the tickets. Yeah, sells the tickets.
Are there any other exciting openings this year, Chris, or in particular things that have been shut for a long time that have suddenly been open to the public?
Yes. So one of the other really impressive openings, which it's not a new discovery, and it used to be open, but again, I think it's been over a decade since it was, is the necropolis of the Via Triumphalis underneath part of the Vatican. So this isn't the necropolis underneath St. Peter's Basilica, where supposedly the tomb of Peter is. It's separate to that, and it runs along an ancient road. It's still in Vatican City, and it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, they found it when they were digging a car park several decades ago, but it's an absolutely extraordinary place with both burials and cremations from around the 1st century AD through to the 4th century AD.
Well, that's a long time period, isn't it?
It's a long time period.
Quite a sequence.
Exactly. And it really gives you an idea of an ancient Roman necropolis or burial ground, because you can go out on the Via Appia, and the Via Appia is beautiful. And there's a few very large tombs that survive, and then there's a few others that have kind of been put back. And it gives you this idea of space between them all, which isn't how ancient necropolises were. Whereas in here, everything is packed in. So someone builds a tomb, and then someone builds a tiny little one next to them. And then someone in between those tombs at a bit of space might just put an urn in straight into the ground, and not build a tomb. And it just shows you this idea. And then you've got cremations next to inhumations. And so you can get an idea of changing practices over time, but also just how busy this is, how absolutely packed, how, we know that when you if you're well enough off, you can buy a tomb and you buy a plot of land, and then you can put up little kipai, little stones around the tomb that kind of say, whatever you do, no one can build within this zone. But then what you clearly see is people ignoring this as well. And the site's fantastic. And so they found a huge amount of material there. And I mean, there's some really interesting tombstones there. There's one from he's a freedman, so a former slave of the Emperor Nero. And on his tomb it says he was responsible for, I think it's the awnings of the theatre of Pompey. And so at one point he's in charge of kind of dealing with the mechanics of working in the theatre. And so there's all sorts. So that's a great site to visit. I think it's only open at weekends, and you need to book and everything. But that's a really pretty extraordinary place that's now reopened, and that's great.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Worth a visit.
And what about sort of exhibitions in 2024? Anything that caught your eye?
Yeah, there were a lot of exhibitions. The Capitoline Museum's had an interesting one on the Greek artist Phidias, which is supposedly the first of a series that they're going to do on ancient Greek masters. I mean, it's a weird exhibition in some ways because it's an exhibition about someone whose work we don't have any surviving examples of. So Phidias, working in 5th century BC Athens primarily, and is, if not the one of the most famous artists in antiquity. but none of his actual works survive. I mean, the closest that you get are the Parthenon marbles, but which part of them he was responsible for is unknown. But it was an interesting exhibition anyway, and they had on loan the very nice find, which is the little cup from his workshop at Olympia that says "My name is Phidias" on the bottom, or "I belong to Phidias" on the base of it. So in the Domus Aurea, there was an exhibition on Egypt and the Emperor Nero, which was quite nice, and the Colosseum had an exhibition on building Trajan's column. The problem with both of these, in some ways, is the location of them. So the Colosseum has long been used for exhibitions, but it's becoming so busy in there that actually it's quite an unpleasant space to go and walk around to see exhibitions. And the parco that runs the Colosseum and the Forum might think of putting them in a different space where you can enjoy it, because most people, you go to the Colosseum to see the Colosseum. You don't necessarily go to the Colosseum to see an exhibition about a completely separate monument. And given the need now to book tickets and the huge queues to get in, yeah, actually that wasn't the best decision, I think.
And there's been, I don't know if these are new discoveries, but a statue of Constantine. This is something new, Chris, an exhibition linked to it?
No, it's not a new discovery. It's so one of the most famous statues in Rome in some ways is this fragmentary statue of the Emperor Constantine that was found back in the 16th century. And it's famous because it appears in all the photographs of, like, there's cats and things on his head, or people stood near it. But it's an enormous
This is
head.
massive, isn't it? I remember this. It's absolutely huge.
Exactly, it's absolutely enormous, and you've got the head, you've got the hands, the knee, basically the extremities of the statue, and that's because the core of it was most likely made of some kind of wood and then covered over, and instead you've got the extremities that are made of marble, and so that's what survived. And ever since they were found in the 16th century, they've caused a stir, and you get the idea of, oh yeah, it's pretty big. A couple of years ago, up in Milan, I think it's Milan, Prada put on an exhibition all about recycling and reuse throughout history. And as part of that, they recreated, using plaster, resin, and other modern materials, a full-size statue from these extremities. So they didn't use the original pieces, but they recreated what it would look like. And the reason that they did it in a reuse exhibition is probably, although it's a statue of Constantine, it's probably recut from a statue of Maxentius, the emperor that Constantine deposed. And even before that, could have been a head of the Emperor Hadrian. There's a small nick in the ear, which is quite characteristic of Hadrian's portraits.
I can imagine this face reducing over time as the marble is chipped away.
Well, exactly. You can see that sometimes when they do that, like the emperor ends up with a tiny little head. So anyway, they recreate it for the exhibition, and following the exhibition, it's now been installed in Rome, and it's there till the end of December 2025 in the gardens of the Capitoline Museum. And it's impressive. I mean, it's 30, so it's emperor seated, and I think it's 12 to 13 meters tall. And yes, you see the fragments, you think, wow, this is a big head. But when you see it put together, actually it gives a real impression of what colossal statuary was like and how imposing it is. I mean, there's certain questions, I think, about the reconstruction, about the kind of the colouring, and one of the fingers is perhaps at a wrong angle. But just in terms of overall, the awe that such a colossal statue inspired, and you think, this isn't even the largest. It's actually really interesting and really impressive to see.
Before we wrap up, Chris, I'm just thinking about the year ahead, and I just wonder if there's anything on your radar that you're excited about because you think, they might be digging there, or there might be a change to some interpretation. Is there anything you want to end with that might be exciting for 2025?
Yeah, so theoretically, and right, so yeah, exactly. So on, at least this is supposed to happen. There are, I suppose, a couple of big things. One is that the piazza around the mausoleum of Augustus is supposed to open. Now, admittedly, the first part of that was supposed to have happened last month, and it didn't. But the piazza might reopen around the mausoleum of Augustus, and that's going to be interesting because that area has been completely closed since 2007, more or less. And then one day, maybe the mausoleum will reopen again. It did a couple of years ago, and then it closed again. And then also, theoretically, 2 of the new metro stations should open, and those are going to be archaeological metro stations. So Porta Matronia, which is kind of built basically just outside of the Aurelianic walls. When they excavated there in order to build the metro station, they found what's most likely a military barracks. Don't know for which regiments or which units or anything like that, but it's very close to a series of other military barracks on the Lateran Hill, where the Equites Singularis, kind of the cavalry Praetorian Guard, the bodyguard of the emperor, is not far from there. On the other side of the barracks of the foreign soldiers, the Peregrini. So it seems to be a military barracks, and that's going to be incorporated into the metro station. And then also, theoretically, the metro station on Via Foria Imperiale, so near the Colosseum, is going to be open as well, which is going to be another archaeological metro station. Not quite sure whether there's going to be finds as in buildings in situ there, but certainly a lot of the finds are supposedly going to be displayed. And so, potentially in the next year, there's going to be some quite interesting things. I mean,
okay, well, that does sound good. Yeah,
sounds really exciting. We'll have to.
Yeah, and lots more tourists with the papal year as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like it's going to be a busy year for you. All right, good stuff, Chris. Well, really exciting to hear about all that. And look forward to catching up next time. Cheers, guys. Speak to you later. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
See ya.